Hill and Longstreet crossed the Potomac that same day at Shepherdstown and Williamsport, and Lee himself made camp that night on the south bank opposite the latter place, intending to cross over in the morning. Before he did so, however, he received from the President a reply to a letter written 2 weeks before, in which Lee had made certain admissions in regard to the present national outlook and had suggested some maneuvers he thought might be available to the Confederacy, not only on the military, but also on the diplomatic front. Our resources in men are constantly diminishing, he had written, and the disproportion in this respect between us and our enemies, if they continue united in their efforts to subjugate us, is steadily augmenting. This being so, he thought the proper course would be to promote division in the northern ranks by encouraging those who favored arbitration as a substitute for bloodshed. Should the belief that peace will bring back the Union become generally continued, the war would no longer be supported, and that, after all, is what we're interested in bringing about. When peace is proposed to us, it'll be time enough to discuss its terms, and it is not the part of prudence to spurn the proposition in advance merely because those who wish to make it believe, or affect to believe, that it will result in bringing us back to the Union. If this was sly, it was also rather ingenuous, particularly in its assumption of such a contrast between the peoples of the North and South, that the latter would be willing to resume fighting if negotiations produced no better terms than a restoration of the Union, whereas the former would be willing to concede the Confederacy's independence rather than have the war begin again. Perceiving the risk involved, after all it might turn out the other way around, Davis contented himself with remarking that encouragement of the followers of the Northern Peace Party was a commendable notion, especially now that a second invasion was being launched at them. Lee replied next morning as he prepared to cross the Potomac that he was much gratified by the President's approval of his views. He suggested, moreover, that Bragg at Tullahoma and Simon Buckner at Knoxville take the offensive against the Union center and thus accomplish something in Ohio. Beauregard, too, could share in the delivery of the all-out blow about to be struck for Southern independence, Lee said, by bringing to Culpeper such troops as he could scrape together on the seaboard for a feint at Washington. This army in effigy, as Lee called it, would have at least a psychological effect, particularly with the hero of Manassas at its head, since it probably would cause Lincoln to make Hooker leave a portion of his army behind when he started north to challenge the invaders of Pennsylvania. Of course, it was rather late for such improvisations, but Lee suggested them anyhow. I still hope that all things will end well for us in Vicksburg, he said in closing. At any rate, every effort should be made to bring about that result. And with that, having advanced such recommendations as he thought proper in connection with the supreme endeavor he was about to make with the Army of Northern Virginia, he mounted Traveler and rode in a heavy rain across the shallow Potomac. This was the week of the summer solstice, and the land was green with promise as Lee rode northward this day and the next. "It's like a hole full of blubber to a Greenlander," Ewell had exclaimed as he passed this way the week before. Hill and Longstreet agreed, finding that his heavy requisitions of food and livestock had scarcely diminished the pickings all around. Marches were so rapid over the good roads that some outfits enjoyed breakfast in Virginia, whiskey in Maryland, and supper in Pennsylvania. Struck by the contrast to the ravaged, fought-over region in which they'd spent most of the past 2 years, the Confederates gazed wide-eyed at the lush fields and sleek cattle and the prosperity of the citizens who tilled and tended them. A Texas private wrote home in amazement that the barns hereabouts were positively more tastily built than 2/3 of the houses in Waco. The sour looks of the natives had no repressive effect on the soldiers, who would ask them for their names so we could write them on a piece of paper, so we told them, and put it in water as we knew it would turn to vinegar. Spirits were high all down the long gray column. "Oh, mein country," the lean marchers called out to the stolid men along the roadside, or, "Here's your played-out rebellion." The Pennsylvanians, in turn, were impressed by the butternut invaders, so different from their own well-turned-out militiamen who had fallen back northward at the approach of Ewell's outriders the week before. Many were ragged, shoeless, and filthy, a civilian wrote, but all were well-armed and under perfect discipline. They seemed to move as one vast machine. Others found that the obvious admiration the rebels felt for this land of plenty did not necessarily mean that they preferred it to their homeland. The farms were too close together for their liking, and they complained of the lack of trees and shade, which made the atmosphere seem cramped and unfit for leisure. Even the magnificent-looking horses, the great Percherons and Clydesdales, turned out to be a disappointment in the end. Consuming about twice the feed, they could stand only about half the hardship required of what one artilleryman called our compact, hard-muscled little horses. It was pitiful later, he added, to see these great brutes suffer when compelled to dash off at full gallop with a gun after pasturing on dry broom sedge and eating a quarter of feed of weevil-eaten corn. Nor was the qualified reaction limited to those from whom it might have been expected. A housewife, questioning a Negro body servant who was attending his North Carolina master on the march, tested his loyalty by asking him if he was treated well, and she got a careful answer. "I live as I wish," he told her, "and if I did not, I think I couldn't better myself by stopping here. This is a beautiful country, but it doesn't come up to home in my eyes." Apparently Lee felt much the same way about it, for at Chambersburg on June 27th, he'd arrived the day before and pitched his headquarters tent just east of town in a roadside grove called Shetler's Woods, where the townspeople came in normal time for picnics and such celebrations as the one planned for the 4th of July, a week from now. He told a true Union woman who asked him for his autograph, "My only desire is that they will let me go home and eat my bread in peace." He said this despite the fact that his ride northward had in some ways resembled a triumphal procession, beginning with a gift of fresh raspberries just after he crossed the Potomac. Though Marylanders noted that he had aged considerably in the 10 months since his previous visit, the gray commander on the iron-gray horse still impressed them as quite the handsomest man they'd ever seen. "Oh, I wish he was ours," a girl who was waving a Union flag exclaimed with sudden fervor as he passed through Hagerstown. And in Pennsylvania, when a civilian whispered in awe as he rode by, "What a large neck he has," a nearby Confederate was quick with an explanation. "It takes a damn big neck to hold his head." The perfect discipline remarked on by civilians as the butternut columns wound past their houses and left them unmolested was the result of a decision Lee had made before leaving Virginia. "I cannot hope that heaven will prosper our cause while we are violating its laws," he said. "I shall therefore carry on the war in Pennsylvania without offending the sanctions of a high civilization and of Christianity." Accordingly, he had instructed his commissary officers to meet all the necessities of the Army by formal requisition on local authorities or by direct purchase with Confederate money. Exhorting his troops to abstain with most scrupulous care from unnecessary or wanton injury to private property, he issued at Chambersburg today a general order commending them for their good behavior so far on the march. "It must be remembered that we make war only upon armed men," he told them, "and that we cannot take vengeance for the wrongs our people have suffered without lowering ourselves in the eyes of all whose abhorrence has been excited by the atrocities of our enemies, and offending against him to whom vengeance belongeth, without whose favor and support our efforts must all prove in vain." In part, these words were written and enforced with an eye to the encouragement of the Northern peace movement. Whether anything would come of that remained to be seen, but the effect on the men to whom the order was addressed was all that could have been desired. No army had ever marched better or with so little straggling. Longstreet and Hill had their 2 corps in bivouac at Chambersburg and Fayetteville, 6 miles east, and their men were in excellent spirits, well rested and far better shod and clad and fed than they had been when they were up this way the year before. Ewell by now was well along with his independent mission. Early was within half a dozen miles of York, and the other 2 divisions were at Carlisle, a short day's march from the Susquehanna and Harrisburg, which Ewell had been authorized to capture if it comes within your means. This now seemed likely, and Lee was prepared to follow with the other 2 corps as soon as Stuart arrived to shield his flank and bring him news of what the Federals were up to on the far side of the Potomac. But there was the rub. Lee had heard nothing from Stuart in 3 days. This probably meant that Jeb and his picked brigades were off on the ride Lee had authorized on the 23rd. But he seemed either to have ignored the admonition to take his place on our right flank, which was highly improbable, or else to have run into unforeseen difficulties, which might mean almost anything, including annihilation, except that it was hard to imagine the irrepressible Stuart being caught in any box he could not get out of. Still, the strain of waiting was beginning to tell on Lee, who spent much of his time poring over a large-scale map of western Maryland and southern Pennsylvania, which Stonewall Jackson had prepared that winter with just such a campaign as the present one in mind. Another legacy from Jackson was a 61-year-old West Pointer named Isaac Tremble, one of his favorite brigadiers, who reported for duty to Lee in Shutter's Woods today, having recovered at last from a leg wound received 10 months ago. "Before this war is over," he told Stonewall, "I intend to be a major general or a corpse." His promotion having come through in April, he'd been slated for command of the division that had gone to Edward Johnson. But his injuries had been so slow to heal, in part no doubt because of his age, that it had been necessary to go ahead without him. There could be no question of his superseding old Clubby, who had done so well at Winchester, yet Lee had no intention of losing the services of so hard a fighter as this veteran of all the Second Corps victories from 1st through 2nd Manassas, even though there was no specific command to give him that was commensurate with his rank. Ewell was moving against Harrisburg, Lee told Tremble. "Go and join him and help him take the place." Before he left, however, Lee drew him into conversation about the terrain just beyond the mountains to the east. Tremble, who had been chief engineer of a nearby railroad before the war, replied that there was scarcely a square mile in that direction that did not contain excellent ground for battle or maneuver. Lee seemed pleased at that, and he told why. "Our army is in good spirits, not over-fatigued, and can be concentrated in 24 hours or less." Not having heard from Stuart to the contrary, as he surely would have done if such had been the case, he assumed that the Federals were still on the far side of the Potomac, and he outlined for Tremble his plan for their destruction. "When they hear where we are, they will make forced marches to interpose their forces between us and Baltimore and Philadelphia. They will come up, probably through Frederick, broken down with hunger and hard marching, strung out in a long line and much demoralized. When they come up into Pennsylvania, I shall throw an overwhelming force on their advance, crush it, follow up the success, drive one corps back on another, and by successive repulses and surprises, before they can concentrate, create a panic and virtually destroy the army." Stirred by this vision of the Army of the Potomac being toppled like a row of dominoes, Tremble said he did not doubt the outcome of such a confrontation, especially since the morale of the Army of Northern Virginia had never been higher than it was now. "That is, I hear the general impression," Lee replied, and by way of a parting gesture, he laid his hand on the dead Jackson's map, touching the region just east of the mountains that caught on their western flanks the rays of the setting sun. "Hereabouts, we shall probably meet the enemy and fight a great battle," he said. "And if God gives us the victory, the war will be over, and we shall achieve the recognition of our independence." One of the place names under his hand as he spoke was the college town of Gettysburg, just over 20 miles away, from which no less than 10 roads ran to as many disparate points of the compass as if it were probing for trouble in all directions. At sundown of that same June 27th, as Trumbull said goodbye to Lee and left for Carlisle to join Ewell, a courier left Washington aboard a special train for Hooker's headquarters, established just that afternoon at Frederick. Though he thus was risking capture by rebel cavalry, which was known to be on the loose, the documents he carried would admit of no delay. In the past 10 months, the Army had fought 4 major battles under as many different commanders: Bull Run under Pope, Antietam under McClellan, Fredericksburg under Ambrose Burnside, and Chancellorsville under Hooker, all against a single adversary, Robert Lee, who could claim unquestionable victory in 3 out of the 4, especially the first and the last, of which about the best that could be said from the northern point of view was that the Federal Army had survived them. Now it was about to fight its 5th great battle, and the import of the messages about to be delivered was that it would fight it under still a 5th commander. Not that Hooker had not done well in the 7 weeks since Chancellorsville. He had indeed. especially in the past few days, when by dint of hard and skillful marching he had managed to interpose his 100,000 soldiers between Lee and Washington without that general's knowledge that the Blue Army had even crossed the river from which it took its name. The trouble was that despite his efforts to shift the blame for the recent Wilderness fiasco, principally onto George Stoneman and John Sedgwick and O. Howard's Rattle Dutchman, he could not blur a line of the picture fixed in the public mind of himself as the exclusive author of that woeful chapter. In early June, for example, the Chicago Tribune defined its attitude in an editorial reprinted in papers as far away as Richmond. Under the leadership of Fighting Joe Hooker, the glorious Army of the Potomac is becoming more slow in its movements, more unwieldy, less confident of itself, more of a football to the enemy, and less an honor to the country than any army we have yet raised. There was much in this that was unfair, particularly in regard to slowness, a charge Hooker had refuted once and would refute again. But it was generally known in and out of Army circles that his ranking corps commander, Darius Coach, had applied for and been granted transfer to another department in order to avoid further service under a man he judged incompetent. Moreover, this mistrust was shared to a considerable extent by the authorities in Washington. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton and General-in-Chief Henry W. Halleck had never liked Joe Hooker, and Lincoln had sent him at the outset a letter which made only too clear the doubts that had attended his appointment. These doubts had been allayed for a time by the boldness and celerity of his movements preceding the May Day confrontation in the Wilderness, when he came unglued under pressure and revived them. Now they were back and in force, as was shown by the day-to-day correspondence between himself and Lincoln, made voluminous by his determination to avoid all possible contact with Halleck, whom he regarded with reciprocal distaste. On June 4th, when Thaddeus Lowe's balloonists reported some Confederates gone from their camps across Rappahannock, Hooker interpreted this as the opening movement of an offensive elsewhere, probably upriver, and reasoned that the most effective way to stop it was to launch one of his own, here and now. Next morning, after directing the establishment of a West Bank bridgehead for this purpose, he wired Lincoln that he thought his best move would be to pitch into Lee's rear, and he asked, "Will it be within the sphere of my instructions to do so?" Lincoln replied promptly to the effect that it would not. He had, he said, but one idea which I think worth suggesting to you, and that is, in case you find Lee coming to the north of the Rappahannock, I would by no means cross to the south of it. In one word, I would not take any risk of being entangled upon the river like an ox jumped half over a fence and liable to be torn by dogs front and rear without a fair chance to go one way or kick the other. Halleck followed us up with some advice of his own. Lee will probably move light and rapidly, he warned. Your movable force should be prepared to do the same. Hooker did as he was told, alerting his troops for a sidling movement up the north bank. But he maintained the bridgehead not only as a possible means of learning what the enemy was up to, but also on the off chance the authorities might decide to give him his head after all. On June 10th, hearing from Pleasanton that rebel infantry had been spotted in force at Brandy Station the day before, he showed that he too, though he considered the Washington defenses quite strong enough to withstand attack, was willing to risk a swap of queens in the present deadly chess game. If Lee had taken a good part of his army west of Culpeper, Hooker wired Lincoln, will it not promote the true interest of the cause for me to march to Richmond at once? If left to operate from my own judgment with my present information, I do not hesitate to say that I should adopt this course as being the most speedy and certain mode of giving the rebellion a mortal blow. Once more, Lincoln was prompt in reply. Unlike Davis, who believed that the best defense of his capital was a threat to the enemy's capital, he was plainly horrified at this notion of removing the army from its present tactical position between Lee and Washington. Besides, he said, if you had Richmond invested today, you would not be able to take it in 20 days. Meanwhile, your communications and with them your army would be ruined. I think Lee's army and not Richmond is your true objective point. If he comes toward the upper Potomac, follow on his flank and on his inside track, shortening your lines whilst he lengthens his. Fight him, too, when opportunity offers. If he stays where he is, fret him and fret him. Next morning, Hooker began the movement north, conforming to the pattern set by Lee, but maintaining what Lincoln called the inside track. This meant that he was required to keep between the Confederates and the capital in his rear, a limitation he found irksome. Moreover, though he knew the rebels had been reinforced for the campaign now fairly underway, his own army was far below the strength that it enjoyed when it marched on Chancellorsville. Nearly 17,000 men had fallen there, and an equal number of short-term enlistments had expired in the past 6 weeks. As a result of these subtractions, by no means offset by the trickle of recruits, barely 100,000 effectives left the familiar camps around Falmouth in the course of the next 4 days. To facilitate the march, which would be a hard one, he divided his army into 2 unequal wings, one led by John Reynolds, consisting of his own corps and those under Daniel Sickles and Howard, and the other by Hooker himself, consisting of those under George G. Meade, John Sedgwick, Henry W. Slocum, and Winfield Scott Hancock, who had succeeded Darius Couch. If the enemy should be making for Maryland, I will make the best dispositions in my power to come up with him, he assured Lincoln on June 14th, only to receive from him a message sent at the same time. Foreseeing the disaster and the present threat to Milroy, the commander-in-chief wanted something more from Fighting Joe than words of reassurance. If the head of Lee's army is at Martinsburg, and the tail of it on the plank road between Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, he wired, the animal must be very slim somewhere. Could you not break him? Strung out on the roads as he was by now, having abandoned the bridgehead he had held for more than a week, there was nothing Hooker could do for the present but keep marching, and that was what he did. Hancock's corps, the last to go, pulled out of Falmouth on June 15th, the day that A.P. Hill left Fredericksburg and Ewell's lead division began its crossing of the Potomac. A simultaneous dispatch from Halleck, warning against wanton and wasteful destruction of public property, snapped the string of Hooker's patience, and he got off an urgent wire to Lincoln. You have long been aware, Mr. President, that I have not enjoyed the confidence of the Major General commanding the Army, and I can assure you so long as this continues we may look in vain for success. This sounded as if he was saying he lacked confidence in himself, the Major General commanding the Army, but it was old brains he meant, and Lincoln knew it. To remove all misunderstanding, he replied, I now place you in the strict military relation to General Halleck, of a commander of one of the armies to the General-in-Chief of all the armies. I had not intended differently, but as it seems to be differently understood, I shall direct him to give you orders and you to obey them. The sting of this was somewhat relieved by a covering letter in which the chief executive explained that all he asked was that you will be in such mood that we can get into our action the best cordial judgment of yourself and General Halleck, with my own poor might added, if indeed he and you shall think it entitled to any consideration at all. However, it had begun to seem to Hooker that Lincoln's advice in regard to Lee, fret him and fret him, was also being applied in regard to himself, not only by the General-in-Chief, but also by the President, whose poor might often made up in sharpness for what it lacked in weight. It seemed to Hooker that he was being goaded, and unquestionably he was. One after another his proposals had been dismissed as rash, or else they'd been urged upon him only after subsequent instructions had placed his army in an attitude from which they could no longer be accomplished. Urgent appeals for reinforcements were rejected out of hand, as were others that his authority be extended to include the soldiers in the capital defenses. More and more, as the long, hot days of hard and dusty marching went by, it came to seem to Fighting Joe that he commanded his army only in semblance, though it was clear enough at the same time that his was the head on which the blame would fall in event of the disaster he saw looming. Leapfrogging his headquarters northward, first to Dumfries and then to Fairfax, with no information as to what was occurring beyond his immediate horizon, he complained at last to Halleck on June 24th that outside of the Army of the Potomac, I don't know whether I'm standing on my head or feet. The next 2 days were spent crossing the Potomac at Edwards Ferry and effecting a concentration around Frederick. His plan was to strike westward into the Cumberland Valley, severing Lee's communications with Virginia, and for this he wanted the cooperation of the 10,000 men at Harper's Ferry, which was beyond the limits of his control, but which he thought should be evacuated before Lee turned and gobbled up the garrison, as he had done in September. On the evening of June 26, believing that the authorities might have learned from that example, at least they had learned to post the troops on Maryland Heights, occupation of which had permitted the Confederates to take the place in short order the time before, along with some 12,000 men and 73 cannon. Hooker wired Halleck, "Is there any reason why Maryland Heights should not be abandoned after the public stores and property are removed?" Halleck replied next morning, "Maryland Heights have always been regarded as an important point to be held by us, and much expense and labor incurred in fortifying them. I cannot approve their abandonment, except in case of absolute necessity." Convinced that the garrison was of no earthly account on its perch above the ferry, Hooker decided to appeal through channels to Stanton and Lincoln. All the public property could have been secured tonight, he wired back, and the troops marched to where they could have been of some service. Now they are but a bait for the rebels should they return. I beg that this may be presented to the Secretary of War and His Excellency the President. While waiting for an answer, either decided the appeal should be strengthened or else he lost his head entirely. Or perhaps, having taken all he could take from above, he really wanted to get from under. At any rate, before the General-in-Chief replied, Fighting Joe got off a second wire to him hard on the heels of the first. "My original instructions require me to cover Harper's Ferry in Washington," it read. "I have now imposed upon me, in addition, an enemy in my front of more than my number. I beg to be understood, respectfully but firmly, that I am unable to comply with this condition with the means at my disposal, and earnestly request that I may at once be relieved from the position I occupy." This was sent at 1 p.m. The long afternoon wore slowly away. The sun had set, and night had fallen before he received an answer addressed to Major General Hooker, Army of the Potomac. Whether the word commanding had been omitted by accident or design, he could not tell, nor was the body of the message at all conclusive on that point. "Your application to be relieved from your present command is received," Halleck told him. "As you were appointed to this command by the President, I have no power to relieve you. Your dispatch has been duly referred for executive action." The wire was headed 8 p.m., and that was where duplicity came in. Halleck knew that the special train had left Washington half an hour before that time, for the courier aboard it was James A. Hardee. His own assistant adjutant general, and Old Brains himself had written the documents he carried. One, an order relieving Hooker of command, and the other, a letter of instructions for his successor. Reaching Frederick well after midnight, Hardee did not wait for morning, nor did he call first on Joe Hooker. Rather, he went directly to the tent of the man who would succeed him, George Meade. This would come as something of a shock to the Army, especially to Reynolds and Sedgwick, who ranked him, but no one was more surprised than Meade himself. His immediate reaction on waking out of a sound sleep at 3 o'clock in the morning to find the staff colonel standing beside his cot was alarm. He thought he was about to be arrested. Sure enough, after a brief exchange of greetings during which Meade wondered just what military sin he had committed, Hardee's first words were, "General, I'm afraid I've come to make trouble for you." And with that, changing the nature if not the force of the shock, he handed him Halleck's letter of instructions, which began, "You will receive with this the order of the President placing you in command of the Army of the Potomac." Shortly before, in a letter to his wife, Meade had commented on the ridiculous appearance we present of changing our generals after each battle. And only 2 days ago, amid rumors that Hooker was slated for removal, he had written her that he stood little chance of receiving the appointment, not only because he was outranked by 2 of his 6 fellow corps commanders, but also because I have no friends, political or others, who press or advance my claims or pretensions. Yet now he had it, against all the odds, and with it a cluster of problems inherited on what was obviously the eve of battle. Partly, though, if he could believe what Halleck told him, these problems were reduced at the very outset. "You will not be hampered by any minute instructions from these headquarters," the letter read. Your army is free to act as you may deem proper under the circumstances as they arise. His main duty would be to cover Washington and Baltimore. Should General Lee move upon either of those places, it is expected that you will either anticipate him or arrive with him so as to give him battle. By way of stressing the fact that the new commander would have a free hand, Halleck added, Harper's Ferry and its garrison are under your direct orders. Knowing the difficulties Hooker had encountered on this question, Meade could scarcely believe his eyes. Am I permitted under existing circumstances, he inquired by telegraph later that same day, to withdraw a portion of the garrison of Harper's Ferry, providing I leave sufficient force to hold Maryland Heights against a coup de main? Promptly the reply came back. The garrison at Harper's Ferry is under your orders. You can diminish or increase it as you think the circumstances justify. Meanwhile, the new commander had called on Hooker, who reacted to the order with as much apparent relief as Lincoln and Halleck had felt in issuing it. In fact, nothing in Fighting Joe's 5-month tenure, in the course of which the Army had experienced much of profit as well as pain, became him more than the manner in which he brought it to a close. Conferring with Meade on his plans and dispositions, he was cooperative and pleasant, except for one brief flare-up when Meade, looking over the situation map, remarked that the various corps seemed rather scattered. Then Hooker quieted down, issued a farewell address urging support for his successor, a brave and accomplished officer who has nobly earned the confidence and esteem of this army on many a well-fought field, and got into a spring wagon alongside Hardee for the ride to the railroad station. Meade shook his hand, stood for a moment watching the wagon roll away, then turned and entered the tent Hooker had just vacated. Presently he was interrupted by Reynolds, who had put on his dress uniform to come over and congratulate his fellow Pennsylvanian. This had a good effect on those who had wondered what his reaction would be, the more so because those closest to him knew that he had gone to Washington earlier that month when it was rumored that Fighting Joe was about to get the axe to tell Lincoln that he did not want the command, for which, with Couch gone, he was next in line, unless he was allowed more freedom of action than any of the Army's 5 unfortunate chieftains had been granted up to then. Now, if not before, Reynolds had his answer, and he took it with aplomb. Sedgwick, too, arrived to offer congratulations and assurance of support, having managed to assuage the burning in his bosom which the announcement had provoked. News that it was Meade who would head the army, and not himself, had reached Uncle John, as the men of his corps liked to call him, while he was out for his morning ride. For him, as for most old soldiers, the tradition of seniority was a strong one. Putting the spurs to his horse, he led his staff on a hard gallop for some distance to relieve his agitation, then rode over to shake the hand of the man who'd passed him by. That hand was a busy one just now, getting the feel of the controls even as the vehicle was headed for a collision. Meade's own elevation called for other promotions and advancements beyond those recently conferred in the wake of Chancellorsville, which in turn had followed hard upon another extensive shake-up after bloody Fredericksburg. As a result, not one of the 7 Army corps was commanded now by the general who had led it into battle at Antietam, and the same was true of all but 2 of the 19 infantry divisions, Andrew Humphreys and Alpheus S. Williams's, only 4 of which were commanded by major generals, Abner Doubleday, David Birney, John Newton, and Carl Schurz. Of the 15 brigadiers in charge of divisions, 7 had been appointed to their posts since early May. John C. Caldwell, Alexander Hayes, James Barnes, Romaine B. Ayres, Samuel W. Crawford, Horatio G. Wright, and Francis Barlow. Equally new to their positions were Hancock and George Sykes, successors to Couch and Meade as corps commanders. In fact, only Reynolds and Slocum had the same division commanders they had had at Chancellorsville, Doubleday, James S. Wadsworth, and John C. Robinson, with the former, Williams and John W. Geary, with the latter. Other drawbacks there were, too. In contrast to Lee, all of whose corps and division commanders were West Pointers except for one VMI man, Meade had only 14 Academy graduates among the 26 generals who filled those vital positions in the Army of the Potomac. This meant that nearly half were non-professionals, and of these a number were political appointees. Dan Sickles, for example, for whom Meade had small use, either military or private. He had, however, for whatever it was worth, a better geographical distribution among his generals than Lee had achieved. 8 were Pennsylvanians, and 7 were New Yorkers, while 3 were from Connecticut, 2 from Maine, 2 from Germany, Schützenauer von Steinwehr, both in Howard's Corps, and 1 each from Vermont, Massachusetts, Maryland, and Virginia. The revised order of battle was as follows. 1st Corps, Reynolds, with divisions under Wadsworth, Doubleday, and Robinson. 2nd Corps, Hancock, with Caldwell, Gibbon, and Hayes. 3rd Corps, Sickles, with Birney and Humphreys. 5th Corps, Sykes, with Barnes, Ayres, and Crawford. 6th Corps, Sedgwick, with Wright, Howe, and Newton. 11th Corps, Howard, with Barlow and Steinwehr. 12th Corps, Slocum, with Williams, Geary, and Schurz. Doubtful as were the qualities of a sizable proportion of these men, 1/3 of whom had been assigned to their current posts within the past 8 weeks, none was more of a military question mark than the man who had just been given the most responsible job of all. This doubt was not so much because of any lack of experience. Meade had performed well, if not brilliantly, in combat as a commander of a brigade, a division, and a corps. If at Chancellorsville, through no fault of his own, he'd been denied an appreciable share in the battle, at Fredericksburg his had been the only division to achieve even a brief penetration of the rebel line, and surely this had been considered by Lincoln, along with Reynolds' unacceptable stipulation and Sedgwick's alleged poor showing in early May, of which Hooker had complained, in making his choice as to who was to become the Army's 6th commander. The question, rather, was whether Meade could inspire that army when payoff time came round, as it was now about to do. He seemed utterly incapable of provoking the sort of personal enthusiasm McClellan and Hooker could arouse by their mere presence. Burnside and Pope, even the hapless Irvin McDowell, seemed downright gaudy alongside Meade, who gave an impression of professorial dryness and lack of juice. What he lacked, in fact, was glamour, not only in his actions and dispatches, but also in his appearance, which a journalist said was more that of a learned pundit than a soldier. 2 birthdays short of 50, he looked considerably older, with a small and compact balding head, a grizzled beard, and outsized pouches under eyes that were serious, almost sad, and rather sunken on each side of what the reporter charitably described as the late Duke of Wellington class of nose. The overall effect, although decidedly patrician and distinguished, was not of the kind that brought forth cheers or a wholesale tossing of caps, particularly when it was known to be combined with a hair-trigger temper and a petulance which tested in turn the patience of his staff. What's Meade ever done was a common response among the men, those outside his corps at least, when they heard that he was their new commander. The general himself had few delusions on this score. "I know they call me a damned old snapping turtle," he remarked. Whatever other shortcomings he might have in addition to lacking glamour, it presently was shown that indecision was not one of them, at least not now in these first hours. "So soon as I can post myself up, I will communicate more in detail," he had closed an early morning telegram accepting the appointment to command. By mid-afternoon, having studied Hooker's plans and dispositions along with intelligence reports on Lee, reports which incidentally turned out to be extremely accurate, the enemy force does not exceed 80,000 men and 275 guns, he was told by Maryland observers who kept tally on what passed through Hagerstown, and this was within 5,000 men and 3 guns of agreement with Lee's own figures, which included his scattered cavalry. Meade had decided on a course of action and had already begun to issue orders that would put it into execution. "I propose to move this army tomorrow in the direction of York," he wired Halleck at 4:45 p.m. This meant that he had rejected Hooker's plan for a westward strike at Lee's supply line. Moreover, the decision was made irrevocable by dispatches not only recalling the units that had gone in that direction, but also ordering William French to march eastward to Frederick with 7,000 men, while the remainder of the garrison served as train guards for the Harper's Ferry stores, which were to be removed at once to the capital defenses. Meade thus was adopting what had seemed to him at the outset the only proper course for him to take in conformity with his orders from above. I must move toward the Susquehanna, keeping Washington and Baltimore well covered, and if the enemy is checked in his attempts to cross the Susquehanna, or if he turns toward Baltimore, to give him battle. Reynolds was retained as commander of the 3 corps in the lead on the swing north, and a warning order went out soon after sundown for the whole army to be ready to march at daylight tomorrow. Strong exertions are required. That meant early reveille and breakfast in the dark, but the men had grown accustomed to this in the 2 weeks they had spent on the road since leaving the Rappahannock. All the same, and even though they'd taken what Lincoln called the inside track, the pace had been killing. Slocum's corps, as an extreme example, had covered 33 hot, dusty miles in a single day while moving up to Fairfax, with the result that straggling had been worse than at any time since the berry-picking jaunt to First Bull Run, just 3 weeks short of 2 full years ago. For the most part, those who fell out managed to catch up at night and start out with their units in the morning, but enough had dropped out permanently, skulking in barns along the way, to bring the Army's total down to 94,974 effectives of all arms. Then, on June 28th, by coincidence, or Sunday, had come a day of rest occasioned by the change of commanders, and now they were off again. Although they did not know just where they were going, at any rate they were glad it was not back to the Old Dominion. "We have marched through some beautiful country," a colonel wrote home. "It is refreshing to get out of the barren desert of Virginia and into this land of thrift and plenty." One thing was practically certain, however, and this was that the road they now were taking led to battle. But that was all right, too, apparently, despite the tradition of defeat which had been lengthened under Burnside and Hooker and was a part of Meade's inheritance. "We felt some doubt about whether it was ever going to be our fortune to win a victory in Virginia," another soldier afterwards recalled, but no one admitted the possibility of a defeat north of the Potomac.